All right. Well, I've got 6 o'clock, and so thanks for being here in the sanctuary, folks, and thanks to folks watching us online. Glad you can hear me. At least that's every indication is that both picture and sound are working on our live stream. Still not sure what happened last week, but luckily we were able to record it, even though we weren't able to get the sound out on the live stream. So anybody who wants to catch up and watch last week, it's there on Facebook, it's there on YouTube. You can access it through our website. It's there. But I do, even though it's there, I do want to just recap a couple of things from last time. And you can see my great shrinking music stand here. Every time I pull it up, I need a lighter Bible, I guess. But I may just have to hold my Bible. Just to recap, we started talking about Exodus, about the 400 years that were in between Genesis and Exodus, how the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob ended up as guests and honored guests at the end of Genesis, and by the beginning of Exodus, 400 years later, they're slaves and under cruel bondage. And we read about the Egyptians feeling fearful of the Hebrew people, ordering the baby boys to be killed, cast into the Nile, how Moses escaped that due to the ingenuity of his mother, adopted by an Egyptian princess, raised as a man of two worlds, Egypt and Hebrew. He killed a fellow Hebrew being abused by an Egyptian, fled into the desert of Midian, married a local girl, had children, became settled in that lifestyle as a shepherd until, as we ended up with the burning bush last week, how he encounters the God of his fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in a bush that is burning and yet not consumed. And we kind of ended on that conversation. And as I pointed out, if you look at the conversation between God and Moses that you find in chapters 3 and 4 of Exodus, Moses repeatedly tries to not do what God is calling him to do. He repeatedly tries to say, I'm the wrong guy. I'm not the right person to do this. And just to recap, in Exodus 3:13, he says, if I go to the elders back in Egypt, the elders of the Hebrews, and I say God sent me, they're going to say, well, what God? What's his name? And God tells him, I am that I am. This is a variation of the name Yahweh, which means the one who is. And then he says, well, what if they don't believe me? And Moses is given these signs by God, these miraculous things that he can do. He can turn a staff into a snake and then back to a staff again. He can turn his hand into a leprosy and then put it back and pull it out clean and without the leprosy. He gives him these signs. And then Moses says in 4:10, I'm not a good speaker. If you want me to go to Pharaoh and make the case and say I'm there on behalf of you, God, I'm tongue-tied. And scholars disagree if he is saying he's just not a good speaker or if he literally stuttered or had some other speech impediment that he is saying I'm not a good speaker. And at that point, God says, well, who made your mouth? Who created your tongue? Don't you think I can help you? And then the last one, this is where we ended last week, is 4:13, Exodus 4:13, where Moses says, after making these excuses of, what if they don't believe me, and I don't know your name, and I'm not a good speaker, and who am I? I'm nobody. The final thing that he says is in 4:13, Lord, please send somebody else. Just please. He's just trying to say, okay, I've run out of excuses now. Let me just beg, not me. Please, not me. I don't want to do this. Please pick somebody else for this mission. And at that point in 4:14, it says, the Lord's anger burned against Moses. And he said, what about your brother Aaron, the Levite? Because he's going back to his last complaint that he's not a good speaker, that he's not eloquent, that he's not going to make a good case. He says, what about your brother Aaron? He can speak well. He's already on his way to meet you, and his heart will be glad when he sees you. You'll speak to him and put words in his mouth, and I'll help both of you speak and teach you what to do. He'll speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth and as if you were God to him. But take this staff in your hand so you can perform miraculous signs with it. So God gives him sort of a little bit of an out about the whole complaint that he's not a great speaker. He says, well, your brother, he speaks well. He can be sort of your spokesman when necessary. He can speak on your behalf, and which is kind of a Middle Eastern thing. Somebody who would be very important might have someone who is speaking on his behalf, someone who is sort of an ambassador or a spokesman or a press secretary or something like that. So God sort of gives a little bit of leeway there, and he says, your brother can help you in this. Now go. He's not taking Moses' no for an answer. He's saying, you will do this. I haven't changed my mind. You are the one to go. So, and we pick up then with 4:18. Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, let me go back to my own people in Egypt and see if any of them are still alive. Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, hey, I was out watching the sheep, and this bush started burning, and then the God of my people, spoke to me. He doesn't recant, at least here in the Exodus account, he doesn't tell Jethro all the details. He instead just says, let me go check on my family back in Egypt. And, there's so much, in so many Bible stories, there's so much that we don't know. We're not told, why does he not fill Jethro in on the full story? Or is this just the author giving us the bare bones? We do know that as, Jethro is the leader of the clan, the tribe, as it were. They're in Midian, and Moses knew he couldn't just leave without more or less getting his permission from his father-in-law. He's come in and become, as an outsider, part of that family by marrying into it, by marrying Jethro's daughter. And so it would be improper for him not to more or less ask permission to leave. And that's what he does, and Jethro then says, go, I wish you well, because he gives his blessing to Moses going. And whether Jethro has any idea about what all Moses is now going to go do, we're not really told at this point. How informed is Jethro? It says, now, in verse 19, the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt. All the men who wanted to kill you are dead. So remember, he fled Egypt after it became known that he'd killed the Egyptian taskmaster for killing a Hebrew slave. And that's why he fled Egypt. He says, well, the people who would have gone after you, they're all dead. We also have to assume, and we'll get to this later, you think, no, we're going to find out later, Aaron is around, his brother's around. And you're like, well, how come Aaron didn't get thrown into the Nile when they were killing all the babies? Well, we find out later, Aaron is his older brother. Aaron is 3 years older than Moses. So we're to assume that this decree to toss the baby boys into the Nile must have happened after Aaron was born. Somewhere that during the time when Moses is newborn, this is a fairly new decree. And we're not told, well, did that decree, how long did that last? Did that last for just a few months and they realized it was not possible to keep this going? The midwives weren't cooperating. And how long was that idea of let's kill all the baby boys? How long was that in effect? But we know that Aaron is an older brother and he's back there in Egypt. I say we're going to told later on in a later verse. It lets us know their ages, and that's how we find out Aaron's older than Moses. So go back to Egypt. All the men who wanted you to kill you are dead. Moses took his wife and his sons, put them on a donkey, and started back to Egypt. And he took the staff of God in his hand, which is going to play a role all through this staff that God imbued with a miraculous power to prove that he is truly an agent of God, that he is not just some crazy guy, that he actually is coming on behalf of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then the Lord kind of tells him what is in store for him there in verse 21. The Lord said to Moses, "When you return to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders I've given you the power to do. But I'll harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then say to Pharaoh, 'This is what Yahweh says. Israel is my firstborn son. And I told you, let my son go so that he may worship me. But you refused to let him go, so I will kill your firstborn son.'" Okay, so here we kind of a spoiler alert. We're kind of jumping to the end of the story at this point about killing the firstborn son. That's several chapters down the road as the 10th plague. Now, here's the question that always comes up, and it comes up, we discuss this in seminary. Anytime I've done a Bible study about this particular book with Pharaoh and Moses, the question comes up. It says, God says, "I will harden his heart." But other times, as we go through this story, other times it's going to say, Pharaoh hardened his heart. So in some verses it says God hardened his heart. In other verses it says Pharaoh hardened his heart. And in a couple of them it simply says Pharaoh's heart was hardened without saying who is the hardener. And what that does when you say, well, here it says God hardened his heart, and here it says Pharaoh hardened his heart, and here it kind of leaves it ambiguous. Well, the question always arises is Pharaoh a pawn in all of this? I mean, did God predetermine that Pharaoh was going to harden his heart? Is this all something that God is really manipulating? Or is Pharaoh a man of free will who is simply stubborn and is not going to bend to what he sees as a minor god of a slave people? And usually the answer is it God hardening his heart, or is Pharaoh responsible for hardening his own heart? And usually the answer is yes. In other words, in a way, both of those statements are true. I believe, and most scholars and professors and folks would say, Pharaoh is doing this, and yet some of those statements about God hardening his heart have more to do with the Hebrew understanding that everything that happens in the world is under God's purview. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the itty bitty baby, and he's got the whole world in his hand. In other words, nothing is outside of God's will. And yet, the other case where this would come up, not only does it say God hardened Pharaoh's heart, we go all the way to the New Testament, and what about Judas? Is Judas acting of his own volition in his decision to betray Jesus? Or is this a piece of a bigger plan? Because Jesus himself, long before he's betrayed by Judas, says to his disciples, and I'm going to go to Jerusalem, and I'm going to be betrayed, and et cetera, et cetera. And so the question again arises, well, does Judas do this of his own volition, or is this all part of God's plan? And again, the answer usually is yes. that both of those statements are true, that Judas makes this decision, and yet Jesus knows what he's going to do. And that, without going down too far a rabbit trail here, part of this is a larger conversation about predestination and free will and all of those things that are a part of theological arguments. And I don't want to unless we really want to, I don't want to go down that trail too much, but to realize that this is a place where Christians have always had a tension between, is everything in some ways predetermined, or does every human being have free will and makes their own decisions? And God is not manipulating events. He may be able to know what's going to happen. He has a knowledge of the future, but he doesn't choose the future or create the future. He allows us to each have free will. We, as Protestants, and specifically as Methodist Protestants, fall on the side of those who would say we are people of free will. There are some churches that emphasize predestination, not nearly as many as there used to be. And in a whole other class, a whole other setting, to talk about somebody like John Calvin, who's considered sort of the father of this theology of predestination. And Calvin is also the spiritual forefather of Presbyterianism, in the same way that John Wesley is the forefather of Methodism. And that divide is much more pronounced in Christianity, was much more pronounced in Christianity in an earlier time than it is now. A lot of Presbyterians, if you ask them if they believe in a strict Calvinist idea of predestination, would say, well, no. You say, well, but you're a Presbyterian. And they say, well, I don't, they would not particularly be well versed in Calvinism. But there is an ongoing tension in Christian theology as to how much we truly have free will and how much God controls. And I as a Methodist and a lifelong Methodist, I fall on the side of that we really are responsible for our decisions, and we really do have free will. And God may have the ability to see the future, but he does not control us like puppets or little automatons. And so all that may be more than you want to go down this road, but you're going to see with Pharaoh, in one verse it'll say God hardened his heart, and another verse down the road it'll say Pharaoh hardened his heart. So anyway, enough about that. So just after that, here's the weirdest part of the whole saga. Unfortunately, 424. At a lodging place on the way, Moses is heading back to Egypt after God told him to go to Egypt. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met Moses and was about to kill him. Like, what? Wait, what? God's about to kill him? He just told him to go, and now God's going to kill him? Why? Well, keep reading. But Zipporah, remember Zipporah is his wife, Moses' wife, who is a Midianite. But Zipporah took a flint knife and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me," she said, and the Lord let him alone. At the time, she said, "bridegroom of blood," referring to circumcision. Why is God angry at Moses? Well, apparently because Moses had failed to do one of the big commandments of all of the children of Abraham: circumcise his son. And this is one of those things that to us seems a little squeamish and a little weird. But if you remember all the way back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when God first calls Abraham and makes a covenant with Abraham and says, "It is your family that I'm going to bless, and your descendants are going to be my special people," and all of that, and they'll be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the sea and the shore. And this is our special covenant between the people of Abraham, the children of Abraham, and Yahweh, God. What is the sign of that covenant? Circumcision. Which, again, I don't talk about a whole lot on Sunday morning with teenagers and kids and everybody because, I've had, occasionally you do have to mention it because it's so prominent in the Bible, and I've had occasionally parents say they got home and their kids said, "What's circumcision?" Well, it's not something that's kind of easy to explain, especially to a younger audience. But it is something that described the covenant, the Abrahamic covenant between God and Abraham. And you read the Old Testament, and how do they refer to their enemies? The Canaanites, the Philistines, the Hittites, and the Jebusites, and all the other ites. They call them the uncircumcised. That's how they refer to the people that they're usually fighting. They call them the uncircumcised. And then, again, not jumping around too much, you get to the New Testament and you get to Paul and the controversy that Paul gets in the middle of. And what is the controversy that Paul is smack dab in the middle of? When Gentiles become Christians, do they have to be circumcised? And Paul spends a couple of chapters on that, and we think that's such a weird thing to be fighting about. But it was a very, very crucial part of the early church as Gentiles began to come to Christianity, and the Jewish Christians began to say to the men, the Gentile men coming into Christianity, well, you got to be circumcised where you can be a part of this thing. Which for a grown man in the first century was not an easy thing to accept or do. And it becomes a big deal in the early church. And finally, the early church decides that Gentiles do not have to go through that to become part of the church, part of Christianity. But this idea of circumcision is all through the scriptures, all the way from Abraham through the new church, the early church. So this is why God is mad at Moses, because he didn't circumcise his son. So it's kind of a weird little side trail there, and you can tell Moses' wife is not happy with this. And she calls Moses a bridegroom of blood. She is not happy that he is now in this conflict with the God who is sending him back to Egypt. So, anyway, we kind of have that out of the way, and we go to verse 27. The Lord said to Aaron, Moses' brother, go to the desert to meet Moses. He met Moses at the mountain of God and kissed him. Then Moses told Aaron everything the Lord had sent him to say, and also about all the miraculous signs he'd commanded him to perform. So there's a reunion of Moses and Aaron. Moses and Aaron, verse 29, brought together all the elders of the Israelites, who are still a slave people, the elders of the Israelites, and Aaron told them everything that Yahweh had said to Moses. He also performed the signs before the people, and they believed. In other words, we're doing the staff into the snake, the hand, it's leprosy, now there's no leprosy. And when they heard that Yahweh was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshiped. So they got the elders there in Egypt, the elders of the Hebrew people on board. So now we're setting up for the confrontation between Moses now going into the presence of Pharaoh. So, verse 5, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, this is what Yahweh, the God of Israel, says, let my people go, that they may hold a festival to me in the desert. Pharaoh said, who is Yahweh? Never heard of him. Who's Yahweh? I've never heard of this God. Who's Yahweh? That I should obey him and let Israel go. I don't know Yahweh, and I won't let Israel go. That's why so often when I see the word the Lord, I make sure that we understand that in the Hebrew, it is the name of God, Yahweh. Older translations or older versions, it would be Jehovah, but Yahweh. That is God's name. And when we just see the Lord, it kind of, well, everybody should know about the Lord. No. Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, the God of my people his name's Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, the God of our forefathers, says to you, Pharaoh, let my people go. But notice, let my people go and hold a festival in the desert. It's not, let my people completely leave and never come back. The request all the way through this is, let us go out into the desert, away outside the property line of Egypt, outside the boundary line of Egypt. Let's go out into the desert, and we want to have a worship service to our God, Yahweh, out there in the desert. And Pharaoh's response is, I've never heard of Yahweh. I don't have any clue about who your slave God is, and I would not let you do that. And again, and we're going to get into it, but you have to remember, okay, who is Pharaoh? What is Pharaoh's life? One, Pharaoh lives in a country, Egypt, which at that time had a pantheon of gods, just like most ancient cultures did. A god of the sun, Ra, and all these other gods of various, fertility gods and moon goddesses and goddesses, just like we read about in other ancient cultures. And as you do sort of comparative religion, we know about the Greek gods, and we learn about the Greek gods. And then we know that the Romans adopt the Greek gods and change some of their names. Ares, the Greek god of war, becomes Mars, for example. But it's really the same thing. So we know about the Greek gods. We know about the Roman gods. We know about the Norse gods. The Norse gods, the main god is Odin, and most of us, especially if you go to see Marvel movies, about Thor, the Norse god of thunder, and his brother Loki, and all the Norse mythology. And almost every culture at this time has their pantheon of gods and goddesses. And the same is true for Egypt. And what is not particularly unique about Egypt is the Pharaoh is considered divine, a son of the gods. The Pharaoh is a son of the gods and is worshipped as a god in much the same way that when we get to the New Testament and we hear about the worship of the Roman emperor, that the Roman emperor is declared to be a son of the gods. So when Moses comes in and says, our God of my people, the Hebrew people, my God, his name is Yahweh, and we only have one. We only have one God. We don't have a whole pantheon of gods. We just have one, and his name is Yahweh. He's the God of everything. You guys have all these gods of this, that, and the other thing. We just have one, Yahweh. He's the God of everything, and his name's Yahweh, and he says to you, Pharaoh, let my people go. And Pharaoh's like, I've never heard of him. He can't possibly be as important or as powerful as the Egyptian gods. So the answer is no. So not only does he say no, he's angry about this. Verse 3. They said, the God of the this is Moses and Aaron. The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the desert to offer sacrifices to Yahweh our God. Or he may strike us with plagues or the sword. If we don't do what our God Yahweh has commanding us to do, there could be big problems. But the king, verse 4, the king of Egypt, a.k.a. the Pharaoh, said, Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labors? Get back to work. Then Pharaoh said, look, the people of the land are now numerous, and you're stopping them from working. The same day, Pharaoh gave this order to the slave drivers and the foreman in charge of the people. And by the people, he means the Hebrew slaves. You're no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They're lazy. That's why they are crying out, let's go and sacrifice to our God. Make the work harder for the men so that they keep working and pay no attention to lies. So, we know, given the time of when we believe all these events are happening, given that we think we know the Pharaoh is Ramesses II, we know there was lots of building projects happening in Egypt. We know that not all of them were the Great Pyramids, but that was some of what was happening, but there's other monuments and tombs and all kinds of things, and some just, palaces for rich people, and the Hebrew slaves are making bricks. And basically they're making them out of just dirt and clay mixed with straw to bind it together, then baked in the sun, and then become the building blocks of houses. And apparently, the old methodology was the taskmasters would have a big pile of straw, and the slaves would then take the mud and the dirt and the clay and get some straw and mix it all together and make the bricks and leave it out in the sun to harden and dry. So Pharaoh says, well, I'll tell you what, obviously they're lazy. If they're thinking about going out on a 3-day trip out to the desert to worship their slave god, they got too much time on their hands. So we're not going to supply the straw anymore. They're going to have to find their own straw. But the quota of how many bricks they are to produce every day does not change. The quota stays the same, but the workload is now harder. That is what Pharaoh does in response to Moses' demand that his people be allowed to leave and go out into the desert for their worship. So verse 10, the slave drivers and the foreman went out and said to the people, this is what Pharaoh says, I will not give you any more straw. Go and get your own straw, wherever you can find it. But your work will not be reduced at all. So the people scattered all over Egypt to gather stubble to use for straw. The slave drivers kept pressing them, saying, complete the work required of you for each day, just as when you had the straw. The Israelite foremen, appointed by Pharaoh's slave drivers, were beaten and were asked, why didn't you meet your quota of bricks yesterday or today, as before? Then the Israelite foreman went and appealed to Pharaoh. Why have you treated your servants this way? Your servants are given no straw, and yet we're told make bricks. Your servants are being beaten, but the fault is with your own people. And Pharaoh said, lazy. That's what you are, lazy. That's why you keep saying, let's go sacrifice to Yahweh. Now get to work. You will not be given any straw, yet ye must produce your full quota of bricks. The Israelite foremen realized they were in trouble when they were told, you're not to reduce the number of bricks required of you for each day. When they left Pharaoh, they found Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them, and they said, may Yahweh look upon you and judge you. You've made us a stench to Pharaoh and his officials, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. Good job, Moses. It's an utter failure. An utter failure. At this point, Moses' conversation with Pharaoh has made life for the Hebrew people worse. And they are so angry at Moses for meddling and increasing their workload. Now, again, we're picturing this enterprise, this brick-making enterprise, and there's levels of, supervision. There's, those who are in charge of the whole project. Then there are Egyptian slave drivers. Then there are Hebrew foremen. And then there are the workers themselves. So the immediate supervisors are also Hebrews. They are the, there's Egyptian slave driver, Hebrew foreman, common laborers. And it is these Hebrew foremen who are most upset because they're the ones who have to deliver the quota with so many bricks a day. The workload has become harder, but the quotas stay the same. And they thanks a lot, Moses. You've just messed your people up really bad. This is not a good start. This is not a good beginning to Moses' interactions with Pharaoh. And so we read in verse 22, Moses returned to Yahweh and said, "O Lord, why have you brought trouble upon the people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble upon this people, and you haven't rescued your people at all." So Moses is like, did what you said what you told me to say, and look, it's worse, and there's no, Pharaoh hasn't bent at all. We're still slaves, and everybody is mad at me. Moses is pretty angry at God, which we're going to see, again, all through this book. The relationship between Moses and God is very frank. Moses, when he is upset, when he goes to the Lord, he doesn't mince words. He's like, "Lord, why are you doing this?" He is very blunt in what he says to the Lord, and God is very blunt in what he says back to him. They have a very blunt conversations, which, I'm not advocating being mad at God, but I'm just saying, when we talk to God, we can be honest. We don't have to mince words. We don't have to pretend that we're not feeling how we're feeling. Moses is very blunt with God, and yet God, lifts Moses up as one of the great leaders in all of history. So, but things are not going well in this part of the story. But it's going to get, it's going to get better. So, chapter 6. The Lord said to Moses, "Now you'll see what I'll do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he'll let them go. Because of my mighty hand, he'll drive them out of his country." God also said to Moses, "I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai." Your Bible probably says God Almighty, but the Hebrew there is El Shaddai, which is translated as God Almighty. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai. But my name of Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, where they lived as aliens. Moreover, I've heard the groaning of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant. The covenant goes all the way back to Abraham. When Abraham is shown and visits the land of Canaan, what today we would call Israel, and God says, "This is the land that I give to your descendants." Which, remember, again, jumping forward to the books following Exodus, the book of Joshua, and then the books of Judges and all that, is an occupied land. It's not just open land. It's an occupied land, and yet God has said to Abraham, "This is your inheritance. This is the land. This is the covenant I make with you, Abraham, that this will be your land." And he says, "I am going to do it. I am going to get you out of Egypt, out of slavery, and I am going to deliver you into that promised land of Canaan." Therefore, verse 6, say to the Israelites, "I am Yahweh. I'll bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I'll free you from being slaves to them. I'll redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people and I will be your God. And you'll know that I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And I'll bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I'll give it to you as a possession. I am Yahweh. So like, this is a covenant. Remember, a covenant is more than just a promise. A covenant is a stronger word than just the word promise or deal or bargain or contract or any. The word covenant in Hebrew, it's the word berit. With English letters, you'd spell it B-E-R-I-T. Berit, the Hebrew word for covenant. It's this promise of God to a group or to an individual or to a people, and it is a promise that God will never break. Now, the people may break the covenant, but God will never break the covenant. You know, the first covenant we see in Genesis is the rainbow. When God says, this is a sign of my covenant, the earth will never be totally flooded again. It's a covenant. And all through this, we have the Abraham covenant. I'm going to give this land to your descendants. And the sign of that covenant is circumcision. So a covenant usually has some sort of sign to it. And this is the covenant he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So they go back to the elders. And it says, verse 6-9, Moses reported, because God gives him this big speech, I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it, I'm going to remember my promise, I'm going to deliver you. Moses reported this to the Israelites, but they didn't listen to him because of their discouragement and cruel bondage. He goes back, God's going to really do this, he's really going to do it. And they're like, They don't really believe it. They're just kind of, it's not going to work. Then the Lord, verse 10, said to Moses, tell Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, to let the Israelites go out of this country. But Moses said to the Lord, to Yahweh, if the Israelites won't listen to me, why would Pharaoh listen to me, since I speak with faltering lips? This goes back to his saying he is not a good speaker. He is not eloquent. And again, was that something about just not being eloquent, or did he stutter? We don't know. But he thinks of himself as not being a good spokesperson or a good. He does not think he makes a good presentation in speaking to Pharaoh. So, and Moses says basically, if my own people don't believe you can do this, why would Pharaoh believe when I tell him you're going to do this? And especially with me as the messenger, because my speaking is not good. Now, a little sidelight here. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron about the Israelites and Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he commanded them to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. These were the heads of their families. I am not going to read all of this. Because this is a list of the names of the leaders of the different tribes. And for most of that, the names here are not going to mean a whole lot to us. They would mean a lot to the original readers and the original audience of this book, because you see it is by clan, sons of Reuben, etc., sons of Simeon, etc., sons of Levi, sons of Gershon, sons of Kohath, etc., the clans of Levi. And we're especially interested in the tribe of Levi. As we said, what's significant about the tribe of Levi? They're the priestly tribe. Of the 12 tribes, the Levites are the priestly tribe. And that is Moses and Aaron and Miriam's tribe. They are all born into the tribe of Levi, which is why, again, spoiler alert, when they establish the priesthood, they're all supposed to be descendants of Aaron. The priests are all supposed to be descendants of Moses' brother, Aaron. It's sometimes even called the Aaronic priesthood. Not the ironic priesthood with an I, the Aaronic priesthood, as in from Aaron, the Aaronic priesthood. which, again, as you go further into the Old Testament, I keep saying spoiler alert because, hopefully most of us at least kind of know where the story's going to go. When they do come into the Promised Land and they divvy up Canaan among the 12 tribes, the Levites don't get land. They are the priestly tribe, and their income is from serving in the tabernacle and eventually in the temple, and the people bringing their offerings to the tabernacle and later to the temple. Then that is how the Levites make a living. And every priest is a Levite, but not every Levite is a priest. The priests are only the descendants of Aaron. There's other Levites who are not priests because the tribe is not just the descendants of Aaron. So every priest is a Levite, but not every Levite is a priest. But the other Levites also serve in the temple or the tabernacle in some way. So we pay special attention to the tribe of Levi, because that is Moses and Aaron's tribe. And so again, I'm not going to read all those names, but they are all there in those passages. And if you really, the one I will mention is verse 20, 6:20. Amram married his father's sister, Jochebed, who bore him Moses and Aaron, or Aaron and Moses. So that is the name of Aaron and Moses' parents, Amram and Jochebed, in case you're wondering the name of the parents. And then we're told about Aaron's wife is in verse 23. Aaron married Elisheba, and their children are Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. We're going to hear more about them later on. Not really very good things, to be honest, about the sons of Aaron. It's not going to go well for them. So anyway, those are all the names that we read. So now jumping down to verse 26. It's mentioning Moses and Aaron. It was this same Aaron and Moses to whom the Lord said, bring the Israelites out of Egypt by their divisions. In other words, in groups according to their tribe. They were the ones who spoke to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, about bringing the Israelites out of Egypt. It was the same Moses and Aaron. They're like, yeah, I think we got that part. Just in case we were missing that, yep, we're talking about the same people here, Moses and Aaron. Now, verse 28, 6:28. When Yahweh spoke to Moses in Egypt, he said to him, I'm Yahweh. Tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, everything I tell you. But Moses said to the Lord, since I speak with faltering lips, why should Pharaoh listen to me? Okay, let's recap. We know that part. And then we kind of have a recap again of God saying something very similar to what we read earlier, but we'll look at it again. 7:1. Yahweh said to Moses, see, I've made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron will be your prophet. You're to say everything I command you, and your brother Aaron is to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of this country. But I'll harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I will multiply my miraculous signs and wonders in Egypt, he will not listen to you. Then I'll lay my hand on Egypt, and with mighty acts of judgment I'll bring out my divisions, my people, the Israelites. And the Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out of it. Pretty similar to what we already read, but just as a recap there. Verse 6, Moses and Aaron, just as Yahweh commanded, Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83, see, I told you he was older, when they spoke to Pharaoh. And so that's why, in movies, usually, Charlton Heston looks pretty old in the Ten Commandments. Some more modern versions of the story, when it's turned into a movie or a cartoon like Prince of Egypt or something like that, they maybe don't make him look quite 80 years old at this point. A lot of the ages that are listed for people in the Bible, we're like, well, is that, how literally are we to take that age? Because sometimes it seems like it's maybe older than we would picture these people. But anyway, he's past retirement age in this story. So, verse 8 now of chapter 7. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when Pharaoh says to you, perform a miracle, then say to Aaron take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh, and it'll become a snake. So, in other words, we gotta show Pharaoh we mean business here with a miracle, with something, a sign to show him that our God is real. So, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as Yahweh commanded. Aaron threw his staff down in front of Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a snake. Okay, you think, well, surely that convinces them. Here's another weird part. Pharaoh summoned his wise men and sorcerers, and the Egyptian magicians did the same thing by their secret arts. Each one threw down his staff, and it became a snake. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. And we're like, no, wait a minute. Okay. We kind of like, okay, so the miracle of the staff becoming a snake, we know about that. And now it's passed it on to Aaron, is doing it instead of Moses, because he's sort of the spokesman now. He turns his staff into a snake. And then it says that Pharaoh's magicians and sorcerers are able to repeat the miracle. And, we kind of like, well, we want to know more about that. But it doesn't tell us any more about that. And we're like, okay, were they really able to also do a miracle, or were they using what we might think of as the same way a magician today does things? When we talk about a magician today, man, they can saw a woman in half, they can levitate, they can do all kinds of things, but we don't really think they're using supernatural power to do it. Okay, Dr. Strange maybe, but other than that, we're not we're not really thinking that they're actually using real magic to do that. One of the reasons I really like Prince of Egypt, the DreamWorks animated version of this story, is the court magicians. If you've ever seen that movie, do you remember who are the voices of the court magicians in that movie? It's Steve Martin and Martin Short are the two court magicians in that thing, and they show them using trickery to repeat the miracles. They show them using sleight of hand to be able to mimic the miracles, which I think is a pretty good explanation. It doesn't say that in the Bible. It just says they use their dark arts or whatever, their secret arts, whatever their secret arts are. Some have said, well, no, they use like dark magic, satanic magic, something like that. I think that's maybe less likely. The Bible doesn't really, it just says they're secret arts. But they are able to mimic at least what Aaron does. But notice Aaron's staff eats their staffs. One of the things as we get ready to talk about now the plagues is to understand what kind of battle this really is. Okay, it's a battle of wills between Moses and Pharaoh. Well, kind of, sort of, but not really. It's bigger than that. Okay, it's a battle of wills between God and Pharaoh. Yes, but it's bigger than that. The way it really plays out, it is a battle between Yahweh and the gods of Egypt. It's a battle to say, which is the real God? Is it Yahweh, or is it all of these Egyptian gods? Is it all of these Egyptian gods who supposedly control all these things that the plagues are going to disrupt? All these things that are going to be disrupted by Yahweh, starting with the Nile, which is a sacred river to the Egyptian gods, all the way through the sun on the 9th plague, which is Ra, the sun god of Egypt. All of these things are showing that Yahweh is the real God, and that these so-called gods of Egypt are powerless against him. So, having said that, I do have a handout. Okay. That we'll use that this week, and folks online, I'll try to, if you want a copy of this, email me and I'll try to email it to you, okay? You want to hand those out? So, as this is coming, what this is a little chart that shows each of the 10 plagues, and it then shows what Egyptian god is being defeated. You know, which Egyptian god is being defeated by the true God in this. And, you know, the graphic says, 10 plagues, the Jehovah God, i.e. Yahweh, versus the gods of Egypt. And just the paragraph there at the top, the plagues of Egypt are well known, but a deep study reveals that each was a direct challenge to the various Egyptian gods and goddesses. The plagues affected the Egyptians' physical senses as well as their hearts, with a reminder that Jehovah God, Yahweh God, was far superior to any of their gods. He exercised power at will while the Egyptian gods remained helpless against him. So we start with the first plague, which is water to blood. And you'll see with each plague, there is an Egyptian god that is being defeated. Now, let's look at the first plague then. The plague of blood, starting at 7:14. Yahweh said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is unyielding. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he goes out to the water. Wait on the bank of the Nile to meet him, and take in your hand the staff that was changed into a snake. Then say to him, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to say to you, let my people go, so that they may worship me in the desert. But until now you have not listened. This is what Yahweh says. By this you will know that I am Yahweh. With the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood. The fish in the Nile will die. The river will stink. Excuse me. And the Egyptians will not be able to drink its water. And the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, take your staff, stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over the streams and canals, over the ponds and the reservoirs, and they'll turn to blood. Blood will be everywhere in Egypt, even in the wooden buckets and the stone jars. Moses and Aaron did just as Yahweh had commanded. He raised his staff in the presence of Pharaoh and his officials and struck the water of the Nile, and all the water was changed into blood. The fish in the Nile died. The river smelled so bad that the Egyptians couldn't drink its water. Blood was everywhere in Egypt. But the Egyptian magicians did the same things by their secret arts. And Pharaoh's heart became hard. He wouldn't listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. Instead, he turned and went into his palace and didn't take even this to heart. And all the Egyptians dug along the Nile to get drinking water because they couldn't drink the water of the river. Now, your chart mentions there, let's look at that for a minute, the part on the right reminds that the Nile is the source of life in Egypt. And there were several Egyptian gods that were connected to the Nile. Hunam was the guardian of the river's source. Hapi was the god of the annual flooding of the Nile and lord of the fish. And Osiris had the Nile as his bloodstream. Now, one of the things that you're going to, as you read different accounts and authors and commentaries about the plagues, there are different ways to read this, depending on kind of people's viewpoint. There are a lot of people who will say, and I'm definitely open to this as a possibility, that say that every one of the plagues has a natural explanation. That when it says it turns it to blood, it's not literally turned to blood, it's turned red because of the annual flooding of the Nile, which stirred up all the red dirt and brought in all kinds of diseases, and that there was that this was not a literal blood, but that it turned blood red because of the way that the annual flooding worked, and it brought water down. This is before the Anwar Dam was built back in not closer to our time, and that that brought with it certain bacteria, and on and on and on, and that starts a chain of events that each of the plagues that follow it, the frogs and everything else, is all there's a natural explanation for it as opposed to a supernatural explanation. Now, the people who say that say it doesn't mean God didn't do it. It says that the miracle is all in the timing. That the miracle is the fact not that the water literally became blood, but that all of these events happened exactly at the time Moses said they were going to happen. But it was something that happens in nature, and that the miracle was that God made it all happen at those precise times. But that some of the things like, the flies and the gnats and the locust and the hail and all those things were things that did happen in Egypt, but they happened in a certain sequence here that was the miracle. Others say, well, no, that, some of those things, yes, did happen, but they would say when it says blood, it means blood. And, I say, depending on what book you read and what scholar you read and what account you read, you get different explanations of that. One of the things that I do think often when we see miraculous things happen, sometimes it is a miracle of transformation, like when Jesus turns water into wine, that's a miracle of transformation. But other miracles, especially in the Old Testament, often seem to have more to do with the timing of something happening that seems miraculous, that things happen at just the right moment, that God causes something to happen that is not outside the laws of nature, but that it's all in how nature chooses that exact moment to create something miraculous. And I believe each of these things was God acting and doing these things exactly when Moses said they were going to happen. Do some of them have explanations that you could say, well, because this natural thing brings on flies or brings on gnats or brings on this. I mean, yeah, sometimes that could be an understanding as well. But the point the Bible is trying to make is every miracle, every plague is a direct rebuttal against an Egyptian god, showing that they are powerless against the true God, the real God. So here it says the water turns to blood. Now, we keep reading. Verse 22, the Egyptian magicians did the same thing in their own secret arts. And again, well, if the water is already all blood, then what did they do? If it was already turned to blood everywhere, what did they even do? I mean, because it says everywhere it was turned to blood, so then what do the Pharaoh's guys do? And it's, again, we wish we had more detail, but it just says they could replicate it. But again, I tend to think they used, what's the word? An illusion rather than magic in the ancient sense of the word. But Pharaoh's heart is still hard. He wouldn't listen to Moses. Instead, he turned and went to his palace, didn't take it to heart, and they have to dig wells to get drinking water. This is the first plague, and it's this kind of almost like this is a warm-up plague. Pharaoh's like, yeah, us rich people, we'll get water. I mean, the poor people are impacted by this, but, I still have water to drink. And so it says 7 days pass. Verse 25, 7 days passed, and the Lord struck the Nile, after the Lord struck the Nile. And the Lord said to Moses, Because Pharaoh doesn't even attempt to say, well, yeah, maybe you're right. He just shuts himself up in the palace and like, yeah, I'm not going to listen to this. So the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, this is what Yahweh says, let my people go. They may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will plague your whole country with frogs. The Nile will teem with frogs. They'll come up into your palace and into your bedroom and onto your bed, into the houses of your officials and on your people, and into your ovens and your kneading troughs. The frogs will go up on you and your people and all your officials. Which sounds delightful, doesn't it? I mean, frogs all over your bed, frogs all over the kitchen, frogs all over everything. And the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the streams and canals and ponds and make frogs come up out on the land of Egypt. So, again, that's what happens. Aaron stretches out his hand over the waters, and the frogs come up and covered the land. But the magicians did the same thing. Again, it's like, well, what do you mean? Because the frogs are already coming out, so they're like, okay, even more frogs come out. I mean, I'm not sure what they're doing. And they made frogs come up. And Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, well, pray to the Lord to take away the frogs for me and my people, and I'll let your people go to offer the sacrifices to Yahweh. And Moses said to Pharaoh, I leave it to you, the honor of setting the time for me to pray for you and your officials and your people, that you and your houses may be rid of the frogs, except for those that remain in the Nile. Tomorrow, Pharaoh said. I would have said, how about now? But he says, tomorrow. Moses replied, it will be as you say, so that you may know there's no one like Yahweh, our God. The frogs will leave you and your houses, your officials and your people. They'll remain only in the Nile. So, all right, I will, just so you know it's me and my God, we'll set the time so that you'll know when the frogs leave, you'll know the timing is because my God, Yahweh, is the one in control. So, after Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh, Moses cried out to the Lord about the frogs he'd brought on Pharaoh, and the Lord did what Moses asked. The frogs died in the houses, in the courtyards, in the fields. They were piled up in heaps, and the land reeked of them. So big, giant piles of dead frogs everywhere, which sounds delightful. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and wouldn't listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. Now, looking back at our chart for a minute here, look at the second thing, the frogs. Hecht was the Egyptian goddess with the head of a frog. So, again, this is a direct confrontation between the one true God and an Egyptian goddess. Well, it's going to get worse. Those first two are just kind of the warm-up plagues. And notice we're going to see a pattern start here. Because the frogs, the water to blood apparently doesn't really get to Pharaoh that bad. But the frogs in the palace and in the beds and in the kitchens and in the bread troughs and in everything and everywhere, that gets to Pharaoh. And he's like, okay, you can go into the desert and do your thing, worship your God, just get rid of the frogs. And I was like, okay, when? Well, tomorrow. Well, you'll know when they go away tomorrow, it's because of my God Yahweh. Yeah. Okay. And he does, and the frogs all die or go back in the Nile. And when there's relief from the frogs, the Pharaoh said, about you guys going into the desert, yeah, I was just kidding. That's not happening. You're not doing that. So the Pharaoh, after he said they could go, he says, no, you can't go. He's going to do this multiple times. He's going to, under the stress of a plague, he's going to go, yeah, okay. I give up. Pray to your God and get rid of this plague, and you can go. And then Moses will do that, and the plague will be gone, and Pharaoh will go, I changed my mind. You can't go after all. We're going to see this happen multiple times. So we've had blood, and we've had frogs. Now we get to gnats, 8:16. Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the ground. And throughout the land of Egypt, the dust will become gnats. Now, some scholars, there's confusion about whether the word is gnat or lice or mosquito. I mean, there's some, because of the words, we're not sure it's gnats. It could be lice. It could be mosquitoes. It could be some other kind of just insect that is a pest and a nuisance and so irritating. But, they think the gnats is the most probable translation of the word. They did this, and when Aaron stretched out his hand with a staff and struck the dust of the ground, gnats came upon men and animals. All the dust throughout the land of Egypt became gnats. And when the magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, they couldn't do it. So, okay, they could copy the staff into a snake. They could copy the water turning red. They could even say, hey, we can get frogs to come too. But they can't do this, as if, why would you want to produce even more gnats? But they can't replicate this one. So they couldn't produce it. And the gnats were on men and animals. And these magicians, these same magicians who now cannot use their tricks or their sleight of hand to reproduce or mimic this miracle. The magicians say to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. Which again makes me think, hey, we can do tricks and we can make things look like magic and we can produce some of these things, but this is real. This is, and whether they're willing at this point to admit it is the God of the Hebrews is maybe a little unclear. The word for God there is not necessarily means the Hebrew God, but they're like, this is real. This is not something we've ever seen before. But Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he wouldn't listen, just as Yahweh had said. From this point on, the magicians are not able to do anything except go, hey, Pharaoh, this is real. This is the real thing. So, the gnats don't make Pharaoh bend his will. Well, let's go to flies then. And just notice before we go to flies, look at what it says about gnats. Geb was the god over the dust of the earth. Remember, most of these pantheons of places like Egypt or Greece or the Norse lands or any other, almost every culture on earth had a god for everything. A god for every, some hundreds of gods. Certainly dozens and dozens of gods. It is only the Hebrews that introduced this idea into the world. There's just one. There's just one God. The flies. Verse 20, the Lord said to Moses, get up early in the morning and confront Pharaoh as he goes to the water and say to him, this is what Yahweh says, let my people go, so that they may worship me. If you don't let my people go, I'm going to send swarms of flies on you and your officials, on your people and into your houses, and the houses of the Egyptians will be full of flies, and even the ground where they are. These are probably like the biting flies. But on that day, I'll deal differently with the land of Goshen. Remember, that's where the Hebrew people had settled way back at the end of Genesis, the land of Goshen, an area, a district of Egypt. Where my people live, no swarms of flies will be there, so that you'll know that I, Yahweh, am in this land. I will make a distinction between my people and your people, and this miraculous sign will occur tomorrow. And now we're going to see this happening, where the plague will strike the Egyptian homes, but when it comes to the Hebrew slave huts and homes in Goshen, it's like there's a force field over that area. It's like these plagues do not penetrate into that area. To make a distinction so that the Pharaoh will see this God is protecting his people. And so the Lord does this. Verse 24. Dense swarms of flies poured into Pharaoh's palace, into the houses of his officials. Throughout Egypt, the land was ruined by the flies. So Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, go sacrifice to your God here in the land. Now there's bargaining. Now begins bargaining. Because what does Moses and Aaron say? What they want to do? They want to go and worship where? Out in the desert, out away from Egypt, outside the property lines, outside the boundaries of Egypt. And Pharaoh knows. Here's the thing, they're both saying, they both know what's really going on. Pharaoh knows that if the Hebrew people go that far away from Egypt, they're not coming back. He knows that. Moses knows that. But it's almost like they're playing this sort of game of, they both really know what's going on here. So he says, well, you say you want to sacrifice to your God? Okay, well, you can do it here in Egypt. In other words, I'm not going to let you out of my sight. If you say, okay, I'm going to give you the day off to do your thing, but do it here. But Moses says, well, that wouldn't be right. The sacrifices we offer the Lord our God would be detestable to the Egyptians. If we offer sacrifices that are detestable in their eyes, will they not stone us? We must take a 3-day journey into the desert to offer sacrifices to Yahweh our God, as he commands us. So, nope, can't do it here. We've got to do it out there. Pharaoh said, I will let you go to offer your sacrifices. I will let you offer sacrifices to the Lord your God in the desert, but you must not go very far. Like, okay, just across the border. Okay, just kind of, you're still in sight. You can go a little ways away. Now pray for me. Moses answered, as soon as I leave you, I'll pray to the Lord, and tomorrow the flies will leave Pharaoh and his officials and his people. Only be sure that Pharaoh doesn't act deceitfully again by not letting the people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord. Moses left Pharaoh and prayed to the Lord, and the Lord did what Moses asked. The flies left Pharaoh and his officials and his people. Not a fly remained. But this time also, Pharaoh hardened his heart and wouldn't let the people go. So, nope. He continues to go back on his word. Let's look at the little chart here. The flies, Kepri, had the head of a beetle and moved the sun. So, and it mentions, of course, in your chart, this is the first plague that only affects the Egyptians. So, many of the Egyptian gods have an insect form of some kind. So let's go on to the next one, the next plague, which is the livestock, which is we're almost halfway through the plagues now. Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and tell him, this is what the Yahweh, the God of Hebrews, says. Let my people go, that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go and continue to hold them back, the hand of Yahweh will bring a terrible plague on your livestock in the field, on your horses and donkeys and camels, on your cattle and sheep and goats. But Yahweh will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and that of Egypt, so that no animal belonging to an Israelite will die. The Lord set a time and said, tomorrow the Lord will do this in the land. And the next day the Lord did it. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not one animal belonging to the Israelites died. Pharaoh sent men to investigate and found that not even one of the animals of the Israelites had died. And yet his heart was unyielding, and he would not let the people go. He is stubborn. If you look at, again, at the little chart about the cattle being sick. Hathor was a fertility goddess who was often depicted with the head or horns of a bull, and sometimes as a bull wearing the symbols of Hathor. Again, we're getting, we know a lot of these Egyptian gods take the form of either an animal or a half-human, half-animal of some kind, which is going to come into play later on when the people of Israel decide to take a bunch of gold and make a calf as a god in the Egyptian style. So, boils. Ugh. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, take handfuls of soot from a furnace and have Moses toss it in the air in the presence of Pharaoh. It'll become a fine dust over the whole land of Egypt, and festering boils will break out on men and animals throughout the land. Ugh. So they took soot from a furnace and stood before Pharaoh. Moses tossed it in the air, and festering boils broke out on men and animals. The magicians couldn't stand before Moses because of the boils that were on them and all the Egyptians. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. He wouldn't listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said to Moses. Let's look at boils and plague. Isis was the goddess of health, and Imhotep was the god of healing. But they cannot stand against Yahweh. Hail! The Lord said to Moses, get up early in the morning, confront Pharaoh and say to him, this is what Yahweh the God of the Hebrews says, let my people go so that they may worship me. Or this time, I'll send the full force of my plagues against you and against your officials and your people so that you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth. For by now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague that would have wiped you off the earth. But I've raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. You still set yourself against my people and will not let them go. Therefore, at this time tomorrow, I'll send the worst hailstorm that has ever fallen on Egypt, from the day it was founded until now. Give an order now to bring your livestock and everything you have in the field to a place of shelter, because the hail will fall on every man and animal that has not been brought in and is still out in the field, and they will die. So this is going to be some big hailstones. The officials of Pharaoh who feared the word of the Lord hurried to bring their slaves and their livestock inside. Those who ignored the word of the Lord left their slaves and livestock in the field. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward the sky so that the hail will fall all over Egypt, on men and animals, on everything growing in the fields of Egypt. When Moses stretched out his staff toward the sky, the Lord said, thunder and hail and lightning flashed down to the ground. The Lord rained hail in the land of Egypt. Hail fell and lightning flashed back and forth. It was the worst storm in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. Throughout Egypt, hail struck everything in the field, both men and animals. It beat down everything growing in the field, stripped every tree. The only place it didn't hail was the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. This time I've sinned. You're like, okay, you got me. Yeah, okay, all right. Yahweh's in the right. I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to Yahweh. We've had enough thunder and hail. I will let you go. You don't have to stay any longer. Moses replied, when I've gone out of the city, I'll spread out my hands in prayer to Yahweh, and the thunder will stop, and there'll be no more hail, so you may know that the earth is the Lord's. But I know that you and your officials still don't fear the Lord God. The flax and the barley were destroyed, since the barley had headed and the flax was in bloom. The wheat and the spelt, however, were not destroyed because they ripened later. Then Moses left Pharaoh and went out to the city, spread out his hands towards the Lord. The thunder and the hail stopped, and the rain no longer poured. When Pharaoh saw that the rain and hail and thunder had stopped, he sinned again. He and his officials hardened their hearts. So Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he wouldn't let the Israelites go, just as the Lord had said through Moses. One more. Well, look at the hail. Nut was the goddess of the sky. Her father, Shu, god of the wind and the air. We'll look at the locust before we wrap up. The locust, the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh. I've hardened his heart and the hearts of his officials, so I may perform these miraculous signs of mine among them, that you may tell your children and your grandchildren how I dealt harshly with the Egyptians, how I performed my signs among them, that you may know that I am Yahweh. Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, here's what Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, says. How long? How long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go, so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will bring locust into your country tomorrow. They'll cover the face of the ground so that it can't be seen. They'll devour what little you have left after the hail, including every tree that's growing in your fields. They'll fill your houses and those of all your officials and all the Egyptians, something neither your fathers nor your forefathers have ever seen from the day they settled in this land. Then Moses turned and left Pharaoh. Pharaoh's officials said to him, "How long?" I think this is what this part of it I really think is a great verse here. Because Pharaoh's officials go to Pharaoh, they say, "How long will this man be a snare to us? Let the people go, so they may worship Yahweh their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" Like, don't you realize? If the locusts come, then there's no food left at all. The cattle have died. The cattle are dead. If the locusts come and eat every green and living thing, we're all going to starve. Let them go. Don't you realize that Egypt is ruined? So Moses and Aaron were brought back to Pharaoh. "All right, go and worship Yahweh your God," he said. But just who is going to be going? Who's going to be going? Moses answered, "We will go with our young and our old, with our sons and our daughters, with our flocks and our herds, because we're to celebrate a festival to the Lord." Pharaoh said, "The Lord be with you if I let you go, along with your women and children. Clearly you're bent on evil. No, have only the men go and worship Yahweh, since that's what you've been asking for." And Moses and Aaron were driven out of the Pharaoh's presence. And the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over Egypt so that the locusts will swarm over the land and devour everything growing in the fields, everything left by the hail." And Moses stretched out his hand, his staff, over Egypt. And the Lord made an east wind blow across the land all that day and all that night. By morning, the wind brought the locust. They invaded all Egypt and settled down in every area of the country in great numbers. Never before had there been such a plague of locusts, nor will there ever be again. They covered the ground until it was black. They devoured all that was left after the hail, everything growing in the fields and the fruit on the trees. Nothing green remained on tree or plant in all of Egypt. And Pharaoh quickly summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "I've sinned against the Lord your God, against you. Forgive my sin once more. Pray to the Lord your God and take this deadly plague away from me." Moses left Pharaoh and prayed to the Lord. And the Lord changed the wind to a strong west wind, which caught up the locusts, carried them into the Red Sea. Not a locust was left in the land of Egypt. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he wouldn't let the Israelites go. So let's look at the locust. Neper and Nepri were the god and goddess of grain, and Set was the god of disorder. So we've had 8 plagues. And notice how he finally said, "All right, the men can go. The men can go. You have to leave your wives, you have to leave your kids, you have to leave your stuff, you have to leave your cattle, you have to leave all that stuff here. The men can go."